Hey everyone, thank you so much for your patience. We are having some technical difficulties, so we just had to switch programs. But I'm so excited for our very first survivor story here on YouTube. We are just so thrilled. We'll have a survivor once a month coming on and sharing their story and sharing their kind of just their insight with us and everything like that and what they're doing with it and how it's inspired them to thrive and not just survive. So excited. My name is Tara Joy Larrick. I'm the executive director with Awaken Justice, and I am also the content creator here on YouTube. So we're so excited that you're here. And so Awaken Justice, what we do is we educate about domestic violence and human trafficking, as well as identity in Christ, so that we can end it completely. And we focus on teens and parents because the average age that victims go into sex trafficking is between the ages of 12 and 14. And so we need to be educating that age range. So that is what we do. We are so excited that you're here. We're also doing a fundraiser over on Facebook. So go find our Facebook page. It's at Awaken Justice. Look at our events tab, and it has all kinds of education, different facts, and videos that you can watch. So head on over there. But before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our channel. Make sure you hit the bell so you get notifications. This is kind of like our kickoff of our YouTube channel. So from now on, we are going to be posting once a week, every Friday. We're going to post all about different things like human trafficking, domestic violence, who you are in Jesus Christ. It's going to be amazing. So make sure you subscribe to that. And so without going any longer on this, I'm going to introduce Samantha McCoy. She is so inspiring to me. Just the fact that she not only is a survivor, but I mean, what she's done after that is amazing. So she is a mental health. She has her degree in mental health and as well as her certificate. But not only that, but she is going to law school. She's in her last year of law school so that she can help survivors and advocate for them. And it's amazing. Just so impressive what she's doing. And not only that, but she went and she lobbied and testified for the Indiana Senate Bill 146, which was signed into law in March. And it expands the rights for sexual violence survivors in Indiana so that they do more trauma-informed approach, which is crucial because I know in my experience, when I went to court, and when I was in a custody battle and I went to court to testify, there was no trauma-informed approach when it came to my experience. And it was actually probably more traumatizing, in my opinion, than not. So that is amazing what she is doing. And so without further ado, let's welcome Samantha to our chat. Hey,
Hi.
Samantha.
How are you doing?
Good. We're so excited. Thank you so much for coming on today and be willing to share your story and kind of talk about what it is that you're doing. This is great.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So just to get started, why don't you just share a little bit about your story, kind of your background, before we really delve into some questions about it?
Yeah, so I think the biggest impact I would say that I had in regard to my sexual assault. So my sexual assault happened my last year of my undergrad year, and it really impacted how I moved forward in my life as well as the trajectory of my career. I also, before that, beginning at the age of 18, I entered into a relationship that was full of domestic violence and very toxic. So combining those two experiences kind of pushed me forward into wanting to make a difference and really made me realize the gaps in the system that exist.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. It is amazing that as survivors, you can go, when you go through it and you see where those gaps are as you experience it. because whenever you're just a lawmaker and you've never experienced it, like, you don't know where those gaps are. You can't really anticipate that. So that's great. So where did you go from there? After you experienced those things, what was the turning point that made you decide to go in the direction that you went with, mental health counseling and, trauma-informed approach and things like that?
So I think there was two different paths and two different moments that I can think of that really clicked with me. So like I said, when I was 18 years old, I entered into a relationship that ended up being very abusive. And I stayed in that relationship for about 4 years. And I noticed throughout the relationship that there was issues. I just didn't feel right. There was a lot of things that were just not okay with how I was being talked to and treated, but I didn't have the education or understanding as to what was going on or why. So I turned it into a lot of self-blame, turned it into myself saying maybe there's something wrong with me. And it wasn't until I started working at a local domestic violence shelter, actually. I was volunteering there, and hearing the other residents talk about their experiences, I was like, oh my goodness, like, this is exactly what I'm going through. It was just a moment that clicked with me where I was like, wow, okay, so this is a domestic violence situation, and I do need to remove myself from this. So it took a while. I'm not going to say that I just woke up one day and walked out, because it doesn't happen like that.
No.
But that was a big pivotal moment for me that really kind of changed how I move forward in my life and my career. And then the other one was the sexual assault that I experienced that I think opened my eyes to a lot of the injustice that happens in our system, and made me really want to make changes that were more impactful than just one-on-one helping with victims.
Yeah. So when you experienced that sexual assault, is that when you, after that experience, is that when you decided that you would go to law school, or was that later?
Yeah, so like I said, that sexual assault happened my last year of undergrad. And at that point, I was already set up to go to graduate school in Syracuse for my master's. And I was still convinced that I wanted to be a counselor. I was still convinced that that's exactly what I wanted to do. And then throughout that experience, when I was working at an outpatient clinic, I was talking with survivors and realized that I was actually navigating them through a broken system. And that really bothered me. I felt like I'm sitting there coaching somebody who shouldn't have to face these things anyway. And that was kind of the click in that moment that made me realize, okay, if I'm going to spend the rest of my life navigating, or I can change the system. And so that really turned me towards law and really pushed me forward into that career path.
Wow. So what was your what made you kind of go towards that Senate bill that you were advocating for? I mean, was it that experience, when you were working in that broken system? Because that's amazing that you went and advocated for this and testified for it. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I never planned to get into the legislative field. I am not well versed in politics, and certainly not my strength. But when I was realizing the injustices that I faced when I reported, that was really what I started having. I started creating a list of all the gaps that I was experiencing, all the things that I wish I had, and then realizing, wow, these can actually be turned into concrete solutions that don't have to just be constant problems that perpetuate and continue on for another victim to face. So that's when I cold called. I did all of the showing up at senators and representatives' doors. I didn't know what I was doing. It was very much just like I really care about this issue. Please, hear me out. Like, these are things that really need to be addressed. You're re-traumatizing these victims when they don't have to be. And there are easy solutions that won't cost a lot of money and are easy to implement, that could be implemented tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So what are some of the flaws that you were seeing in the system that you had to kind of work around when you shouldn't have to be. What were you fighting against?
Ooh, there are so many. So just to begin with, when somebody is raped, they go and get a rape exam done. And in that process, I realized in certain areas, depending on your location, you're not going to get a forensic nurse that's trained in sexual assault. And so in my case, I didn't get anybody that was trained. And I think that further damage because they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to approach me in a trauma-informed way. It was just very much here's a camera, we're going to pull it out and take pictures of your injuries, and now move to this room and do this, and let's go quickly, and the police are waiting outside. And so it was very much like a very chaotic scene, and I couldn't even process what was going on, but I was expected to navigate it by myself. And that was another thing, was not having a victim advocate. So in Indiana specifically, at that time, there was no advocate given to you. You kind of have to just do it yourself. And so again, when you're trying to walk the police to the crime scene, you're giving them evidence, you're going to the emergency room, and then they're like, okay, well, now sit in a room by yourself, and you've got to figure all this out. You don't know what's next. I had no familiarity with the criminal justice system in general. So it was just incredibly overwhelming, not having somebody that was just there to guide me through that process and know what to expect.
Right. Well, and how would you know what to do? Like that's, as just a person who doesn't have their law degree, at least at that point, it's how in the world do you, how do you know? Like it just, when they're expecting you to know exactly what you need to do and how to handle all of this, and without doing that, I mean, that is devastating. I mean, especially because then it just, in that situation, I know in my own situation with domestic violence, like if I felt out of control as it was, and then they're basically saying like, oh, here, you get to do it too. And you're like, what? That was kind of my experience in the court system was that I had to basically navigate it myself, having to testify and, not really knowing, okay, well, what's the best thing for law enforcement? What's the best thing to do? Like, I was like, well, should I get a protection order? Should I not get a protection order? I don't know. There's no real guidance, and that really does create trauma, a massive amount of trauma.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So just for the people who don't really know, what is the trauma-informed response? Like, what is that, and how can people be using it in their lives as they're dealing with, maybe friends or family who have gone through trauma?
Yeah, so a trauma-informed approach really takes the lens of focusing in on the trauma impact. So it takes into consideration not only what exists, but also what trauma does to a person. So we know neurologically trauma impacts your brain. We know that it can cause psychosomatic symptoms in which you're having physical pain, but there's no actual physical injury. One of the relational diagnoses that a lot of people use is ADHD in children. So there was an incredible amount of children who were diagnosed with ADHD. And when they were looking into it, they realized that it was actually trauma, but the symptoms were so similar to ADHD that they were misdiagnosing children with the wrong diagnosis. And then with that led to putting them on medications in which they were never meant to be on in the first place. Right. So what the trauma-informed approach does is it focuses on the root cause of the issue and really hones in on the trauma that person's experienced specifically to find the best treatment for that person.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, just knowing that, I feel like if our court systems can implement that, then the experience, I think, for survivors will be much more empowering than it is currently. So how did that look in your Senate bill? What changes were made from that bill?
So yeah, Senate Bill 146 really, like you said earlier, it expanded the rights for sexual assault survivors. And what it focused on was just a small piece. So by no means is this an exhaustive bill that covered everything. It was really just a beginning step in the right direction. And using that trauma-informed approach, it focused in on the victim advocate aspect. So ensuring that that person has someone to guide them through the process, sit with them while they're with the nurse, as well as sitting with them while they're being investigated through law enforcement. And that's a trauma-informed approach, obviously, because it's guiding that client, making sure they're okay, having somebody with them to support them emotionally, but also guide them through the complicated process that they're about to go through.
Yeah. And, that can make all the difference, really, because I know in my domestic violence training, out in California and LA, they have a victim advocate that goes to, in this instance, domestic violence cases, and they literally go to the victim that evening and they help kind of start guiding them in that process. Well, what they found was if there's a victim advocate, they're more likely to testify against their abuser or the person who's assaulted them, and they're more likely to get a conviction because of that, and because of the fact that they have someone to help them through that very overwhelming process. And so just even making sure that sexual assault survivors, domestic violence survivors have a victim advocate, it's crucial.
Absolutely. And obviously, when you're reporting and you're realizing, wow, this system is really set up against me. I've got to go through this. I've got to go through that. My mental health is suffering. I'm losing my job. Now I've got another court hearing and now they're asking me for this. And just the pure exhaustion alone, trying to do that by yourself, it's really impossible. And so a lot of flawed systems kind of bank on that. They bank on the survivor kind of being so exhausted that they're like, I give up, like I can't do this anymore. And it's really sad because then that person goes on and perpetrates against someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do you know what the this is just coming off the top of my head. Do you know what the amount of convictions are right now in like sexual assaults?
Oh goodness. So I know it's like, RAINN has a wonderful graph on their website. I don't want to misspeak. I think it's like 1 in 1,000 are convicted. It's incredibly low. And they kind of graphed it out to where it's like how far off they're dropping. So from the report process all the way down to an actual conviction, and it just gets smaller and smaller.
Wow. And I will find that and I'll make sure to link that below just for anybody who wants to look at that, because I know that it's incredibly low, just the amount, because it is such an overwhelming and exhausting process, especially while they're dealing with trauma and trying to heal at the same time. And it's, at least in my case, when I went to court, I could not heal while I was in that process. Like I was still kind of in a survival mode through that process. And I don't think that's healthy by any means.
Absolutely. And when the case goes on, when they're extending it and when it gets more complex, it's just delaying the inevitable. It's continuing the trauma. It's continuing to relive it, asking you to recount it in front of people, and really makes the healing process kind of just stagnant.
Wow. So let's kind of go back a little bit on your just mental health counseling and your, getting a law degree. How do you see those intersecting? Because I know that, it's obviously helped with this bill, but in the future, what is your hope for that in order to help survivors? Like how are you going to be able to use that?
So I think, and this is my opinion, but I think mental health is completely correlative to the law. So if we think about family law, for example, divorce cases, domestic violence, child custody issues, all of those things involve an aspect of mental health. So obviously when someone's going through a divorce or a nasty custody battle, it's going to bring up emotions. People are going to react in different ways. People with domestic violence, the most dangerous portion is leaving. So knowing all of that, it kind of requires you to have some kind of understanding of trauma. With the criminal justice system, the vast majority of people incarcerated, have underlying mental health conditions. And then expanding it to survivors' rights, which is what I'm most passionate about, and even in prosecution settings. If you're not able to talk about emotions or understand what that victim's going through, it not only hurts the trust and the communication between you and the victim, but it also could lead to victims dropping off, victims not wanting to comply anymore or go forward with the process because they feel defeated, they feel unsupported, they feel like this person that's supposedly advocating for them doesn't actually have their best interest at heart. And one of the things, I worked for the DA's office in New York on the Special Victims Unit for a short stint. And they really utilized me to talk to the survivors because the attorneys were like, we don't do emotion, we can't handle emotion, we're not good at that. And I appreciated them like reaching out and doing that, but it's also like, it's kind of required if you're going to be working with a population which has so much trauma. You have a 4-year-old coming out expressing a sexual abuse. You have to be able to talk to them in a way that doesn't re-traumatize them, but also supports them and makes them want to go forward with the case.
Right, exactly. So how do you think, when it comes to attorneys, what do you think needs to be kind of more of like a requirement for attorneys in order to see that change? Because obviously, there are attorneys and not police officers as well. They can have that, well, I don't believe you, or kind of say something or do something in a way that it does re-traumatize them. So what is your hope that eventually will happen in those fields?
So I think there's a clear need in the law field specifically to at least have some kind of introduction to trauma, to even just basic responses, handling basic emotion. It's kind of, in classes, it's been really interesting because, for example, in my family law class, the professor made a comment about like, oh, well, you guys are just lawyers, so you don't have to deal with all the messy emotions and crying. And it's like, well, that's kind of giving a false hope, because in reality, you're going to have to, like, your client's calling you, they're going to be upset, you're going to be in court with them, they're going to cry, they're going to have emotions, like, to just kind of push it off to another field like social work, it's just ineffective. So I think there does need to be some kind of mandatory implementation of training, and kind of, we already have to do, continuing education hours. So really having more programs within that focus on the mental health aspect, and not just a pattern of let's push it to someone else to deal with.
Right. Well, that's amazing. So going on the line of like education, how do you think that education on abuse and sexual assault, really, how do you think that education on that has helped you? And how would education on that help other either victims or people who haven't experienced that kind of trauma?
Yeah, so I think education helped me personally on a level of understanding why I was feeling what I was feeling. So in the moment, it brings up a lot of emotions. Obviously, whether you're going through domestic violence, whether you're going through a sexual assault, so many emotions you're trying to process. You're trying to understand why am I feeling this way? Why am I having this reaction? And I think that education piece helped me understand those reactions, but it also helped me realize like I wasn't alone, and that I wasn't going crazy, and that it's completely normal. So I appreciated that aspect of it. Now, professionally, I think that education helps you better empathize, even if you've never been through it. If you're able to see the impacts that it truly has, and at least even somewhat grasp the impact that it has. You might not be able to fully understand it if you haven't experienced it. But if there's some kind of educational piece that lends that little piece you need to just be a little more empathic, ask the right questions, approach things in a more sensitive way, so you're not coming off, okay, what do you want? Yeah, you're here, let's get through this approach, which is very demeaning to survivors, even if they don't mean to be. So I think education is huge across the board for everyone, whether you're a survivor or whether you've never experienced anything like that.
Yeah, that is so on point. Even just having empathy for other people. I think we often forget, I think that, we can't always understand, but we forget that other people are humans too sometimes, and remembering that they have their own trauma and trying to make sure that we're sensitive to that is really important. So as we end this, kind of my last real question is, your story and just what you've taken from your experiences. And while I know that there has been trauma there and how you've I'm sure that there is hurt and just frustration and all of those negative emotions, but just how you've been able to take that and kind of transform it into this very powerful, career and life, just going and making change and being an advocate and being someone who's being proactive as opposed to just sitting there, just kind of wallowing in it. We all have a tendency sometimes to do that. And what is it that you can say to other survivors who are maybe in the part of their healing where they're not at that point yet, and they're kind of sitting there wondering, will I ever get past this? Am I going to, even be able to thrive in a way after surviving something like this? What can you say to them?
So I think you hit on a good point. It really, before you can move on and help other people, you have to be in the right space. So my experience, unfortunately, it's something that I've kind of regretted, was I jumped right into wanting to do something. So I'm a very action focused person. So when something happens, I want to find the solution. I want to try it. I want to work it out. And I didn't allow myself that time to heal. And so when I was offered speaking events and other opportunities, I jumped on them without really processing what that's going to mean going forward. So I would get myself at the very beginning into situations in which I'm speaking to, large groups of people, and I'm just overwhelmed with emotion and I can't do it. And so that was something that I needed to just take that moment to realize I'm not ready yet. I'm in this moment and I just need to accept that I'm not ready and work on myself internally. And so I really turned to counseling for after that realization, to make sure that I was handling, and I did the EMDR. So I don't know if you're familiar, but
I'm currently doing it. Yeah.
It's incredibly effective, and it has wonderful, wonderful rates of success. But after you're able to heal and you're in that position where you're like, okay, I finally feel like I'm ready. And some people, you're never going to fully get over it. So I don't want to come off and say, wait until you're fully over it, because that could be never, unfortunately. But where you're at a point where you can feel comfortable and you know when to ground yourself, you know how to ground yourself. Like, okay, I'm triggered right now. What can I do right in this moment that can ground me back into reality so I'm not acting off of emotion? And once they're able to do that with support, then that's when you start exploring your interests. Do you like advocacy? Is grassroots lobbying really something you like to do? Go testify for a bill, go see what's pending. There are sexual assault survivor and domestic violence survivor bills pending all over the United States. Go and testify for one of those. If your interest is education, go and look for universities. They're always looking for people to come and do prevention work and presentations. And then, if you like the one-on-one client work, look for hotlines to work for if you think that you're ready for that. Advocate for clients one-on-one and be able to directly talk to them. So there's so many avenues, and it really depends on the person's interest. But I think the key part is just making sure you have the support around you to be able to do that, as well as you've worked to a place where you can ground yourself in those moments when you could feel triggered.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I mean, you just are a wealth of wisdom and really just in awe of everything that you're doing. So thank you again for sharing your story and for kind of providing hope for other survivors, and as well as some real life adjustments that need to be made in our justice system. So thank you so much. All right, guys. Well, that was our our first survivor story with Samantha. It was amazing. Thank you, Samantha, again so much. That was great. Make sure you come back next week. We'll be posting a video on next Friday. And then at the end of August, we'll have another survivor story. So be on the lookout for that stuff. See you guys later.